What would you do if a dying woman's last hope was the water in your canteen, and helping her would cost you everything you'd built? Days later, 14 Apache riders reached that rancher's gate at dawn, and the whole valley held its breath, certain it meant war. Her name was Tahnee. His was Gideon Hale. Arizona Territory, 1886, the third summer of a drought, so cruel it turned neighbors into judges of who deserved to live. What Gideon did beside a sandstone boulder in the open desert, what Tahnee's family did to repay it, would change that valley forever. Stay till the end, because this true-to-the-frontier tale proves one act of kindness, given when it costs the most, can turn strangers into something stronger than family. Now let's go back to where it began on a morning that looked like every other dry, merciless morning that summer, except that it wasn't. The desert did not care who you were. It tested the rich, the same as the poor, the settler the same as the traveler, and by the third summer of drought, even the hardest men in the territory had learned to speak of the land the way you'd speak of something that could kill you without ever raising its voice. Water had stopped being a convenience and become a currency, and every family for 100 miles guarded what little of it they had, the way other men guarded gold. Nobody understood that better than Gideon Hale. His ranch sat alone at the far edge of a wide valley, where the grass gave out and the earth climbed slowly into red cliffs and canyons the color of old rust. It was not the largest spread in the territory. It had never made him rich, and that summer it was closer to breaking him than it had ever been. But it had been his home since his father drove the first fence post into that ground, and Gideon had never once considered leaving it, not even in a year when leaving would have been the sensible thing to do. He had been alone on that ranch for 3 years by then, ever since a fever took both his parents inside the same hard winter and left him, the only Hale still standing on that land. Neighbors offered to buy him out more than once, kindly enough the way people offer help they half hope you'll refuse. Gideon always thanked them and always said no. A ranch built one fence post at a time by a man who was gone now wasn't the kind of thing you traded away because the rain had stopped falling. He worked it alone from before sunup until well past dark, and if the solitude of that ever wore on him, he had learned not to let it show, even to himself. The whole valley was feeling the same slow squeeze that summer, not just Gideon. Wells that had run clear and cold for 30 years now pulled up water the color of weak tea, and more than one family had already packed a wagon and gone looking for easier ground further west. The ones who stayed grew careful in ways that had nothing to do with money. A man counted his neighbor's cattle at the fence line now the way he once might have simply waved. Doors that used to stand open through the heat of the day were shut and latched by noon. It was the kind of drought that didn't just dry up creeks. It dried up a little of the goodwill people usually kept in reserve for each other, and left everyone a shade more suspicious of everyone else long before an Apache family ever entered into it at all. Gideon had watched that change come over his neighbors slowly, the same way he'd watched the creek behind his own barn shrink inch by inch, and he did not much like what either one was turning into. Every morning began the same. He was in the saddle before the heat rose off the flats, riding the fence line, counting cattle that grew thinner by the week, watching the sky for a cloud that never came. Every morning ended the same too, with the same disappointment settling into his shoulders like dust. The creek that used to run behind his barn had shrunk to a crack in the clay. The stock pond had turned to hard cracked mud with a skeleton of dead cattails standing in the middle of it. Even the prickly pear looked exhausted, its pads shriveled and pale, as if the whole desert had simply given up arguing with the sun. That particular afternoon, Gideon rode farther west than usual, out toward the ridge, where a section of fence had gone down in the night, trampled by cattle spooked by something he never found tracks for. He carried a small canvas roll of tools, a coil of wire, and one canteen that was by his own careful rationing still nearly 3/4 full out here, in a summer like this one that made him a wealthy man. He followed a trail that wound between broken boulders and brush, gone the color of old bone, the only sounds the slow clop of his horse's hooves, and somewhere far off, the thin cry of a hawk riding the heat. The sun climbed higher. Heat lifted off the flats in long, wavering sheets, bending the horizon until it looked like a lake that wasn't there, the kind of mirage every rider in that territory had learned to distrust on sight. Gideon wiped the sweat from under his hat brim and stopped his horse in the meager shade of a lone cottonwood that had somehow held on beside a creek bed that hadn't carried water in a month. It was there that his horse lifted its head, ears swiveling south, nostrils working at something on the wind that Gideon couldn't smell yet. He followed the animal's gaze and found what had unsettled it: vultures. 4, then 5 of them, circling low and patient over a rocky rise less than half a mile off. In country like this, a man learned fast what that circling meant. It meant something had already died, or was close enough to it that the birds had decided to wait. His stomach tightened without his permission. He nudged his horse forward, and the closer he rode, the more the quiet pressed in on him, a quiet with a weight to it, the kind that made a man's hand drift toward the stock of his rifle without him quite deciding to put it there. The heat here was worse somehow than out on the open flats, trapped and radiating up off bare rock in a way that made his shirt cling to his back before he'd covered half the distance, and he found himself hoping foolishly that whatever the birds had found belonged to no one at all. Just some unlucky coyote or a stray steer that had wandered too far from water. As he came around the base of the rise, the birds lifted lazily off whatever they'd been circling and drifted higher into the pale, colorless sky, patient enough to wait a little longer. What waited at the bottom of that slope was not what Gideon expected, and it stopped him cold in the saddle. An Apache family had taken shelter against the only shade for a mile in any direction, a wide sandstone boulder that threw a strip of shadow barely wide enough to hold them. A woman sat with her back pressed to the rock, one arm around each of 2 small children whose lips had cracked and split from the heat, their small chests rising too fast, too shallow. A few feet away, an old man lay on his side, one arm folded over his chest, so still that for one terrible second, Gideon was certain he was already gone. Their horse lay collapsed nearby in the dirt, its sides barely moving past the point of getting up again on its own. There was no wagon, no shade cloth, nothing but the boulder and whatever will had carried them this far. Not a sound passed between any of them. The woman lifted her eyes to Gideon as he reined in, and what he saw there was not the fear he half expected, and not anger either. It was the flat, quiet exhaustion of someone who had already done the arithmetic on how much longer they had left, and had come up with an answer she wasn't going to say out loud in front of her children. Gideon sat his horse a dozen feet away, and did not move any closer. His hand found the strap of his canteen without him telling it to. Every warning he had grown up hearing came rushing back at once, all in a single breath, the way old fear does. Neighbors who swore an Apache man's word was worth nothing at all. Rider stories of stolen horses and burned barns and old raids that had left scars up and down this territory for 2 generations, told and retold at enough firesides that a boy grew up believing them the way he believed the sun would rise. Half the men he'd grown up beside would have turned their horse around right there and ridden home without a word about what they'd seen, and slept soundly enough. That same night, he looked past the woman to the 2 children instead. The younger one, a boy no older than 5, could barely keep his eyes open, his small body swaying where he sat, and something in Gideon simply refused to turn that horse around. He knew exactly how much water sat in that canteen against his hip, and he knew exactly what it would cost him to empty it out here, a 2-hour ride from his own well, with nothing left to drink on the way home. He knew, too, what it would cost him in another currency entirely, the kind paid out in whispers and cut fences and doors that didn't open for a man anymore. Fear and something gentler pulled at him from two directions at once, and for one long moment neither one won. Then a memory rose up out of nowhere, unbidden, the way memories do exactly what a man needs one. His mother, years gone now, standing in the doorway of the cabin his father built, raking the last of the morning's bread into the hands of a traveler who had nothing to trade for it. As a boy, he'd once wondered aloud why she gave away food. They scarcely had enough of themselves. She had looked at him with an expression he never forgot. Kindness is worth the most, exactly when it costs you something. Free kindness, she'd taught him, isn't really kindness at all. It's just what's left over once you've kept everything you actually wanted. Gideon let out a slow breath and swung down from the saddle. The woman watched him with careful, unmoving eyes, but made no sound and no sudden move, only pulled the smaller child an inch closer against her side. Gideon unhooked the canteen from his belt and walked toward the children first, slow, both hands visible, the way a man might approach a spooked animal he had no intention of frightening further. He dropped to one knee in front of them, uncapped the canteen, and poured a careful measure into the crown of his own hat. He held it out to the boy first. Small, trembling hands closed around the brim, and the child drank in slow, careful pulls, the way a body drinks when it has already learned the hard way not to trust water to still be there tomorrow. The older child, a girl, took only a few sips before her eyes went to the old man lying motionless a few feet away, and Gideon understood the question in that look without needing a single word to carry it. He moved to the old man's side, lifted his head as gently as he could manage, and tipped a little water past his cracked lips. Nothing happened at first, and Gideon's chest went tight with a fear he hadn't expected to feel for a stranger. Then the old man's throat worked, once, twice, and his eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding Gideon's face and holding there. Relief broke across the woman's face like sun through cloud. She closed her eyes for one brief moment, her lips moving with no sound behind them, and Gideon understood that too, without needing the words for it. Then he held out what remained of the canteen to her. She took it with both hands, drank only enough to steady the shake in her own fingers, and passed what little was left to her children. Not one word passed between any of them the whole time. They did not share a language. Out here, in that hour, they did not need one. If tonight's story is landing with you the way it landed with me, consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button right beside the channel name. It's a small way to keep frontier stories like this one coming. As the shadows stretched longer across the rocks, Gideon studied the surrounding hills with a rancher's eye, turning over what he knew of this country. There was a spring, he remembered, tucked deep inside a narrow canyon a mile or so to the north, one that ran only in the driest years, hidden under a shelf of stone most folks in the valley had long since forgotten. If it was running this year, of all years, it might be this family's only chance. He packed what little food he carried, some jerky, a small sack of cornmeal, into a cloth bundle and lashed it behind his saddle. Then he pointed north, toward the canyon mouth, and made a slow, deliberate motion with his arm, the kind that needed no translation at all. The woman rose first, helping the old man to his feet with the girl steadying his other side, while the boy gathered close against her skirts. Together, they began the long, silent walk across the baking flats, following a rancher they had every reason not to trust, because in that moment he was the only chance any of them had left, and something in the woman's face said she had already decided to take it. The spring, when they reached it, was barely more than a trickle threading down a crack in the stone, into a shallow pool no bigger than a wagon wheel, ringed by a few stubborn patches of green grass that had somehow survived where nothing else had. To that exhausted family, it might as well have been a river. Gideon helped the old man settle at its edge, while the children dropped to their knees and drank in long, grateful pulls, their faces slowly coming back to something like life in front of him. He watched the color return to the boy's cheeks and felt something in his own chest loosen that he hadn't known was tight. For the first time since he'd come around that rise and found them, Gideon let himself believe they might actually survive this. He set the food bundle down beside the spring and pointed back toward the canyon walls, hoping they understood he meant for them to stay hidden here until their strength returned, out of sight of any rider who might pass this way, with less patience than he had. The woman rose and looked at him, and something passed over her face that Gideon would carry with him for a long time after. She lifted one hand and pressed it flat over her own heart, and inclined her head in the smallest of nods. Gideon didn't fully grasp the gesture, not then, but he understood the feeling behind it well enough, and he returned it the only way that felt honest, by pressing his own hand to his chest and giving the same small nod back. Neither of them had a single word of the other's language, and yet something had already taken root between them that afternoon that didn't need one. He turned to go, and at the canyon mouth he looked back one last time. The two children stood close beside their mother, and the girl lifted a small hand in a shy, uncertain wave. Gideon lifted his hat to her in return, then turned his horse toward home, his canteen hanging empty and light against his hip, the 2-hour ride back stretching out ahead of him under a sun that showed no sign of mercy. By the time he rode into his own yard, the sky had gone the color of a dying ember, streaks of orange bleeding into deep purple over the western ridge. He tended his horse, finished what chores couldn't wait, and tried to convince himself, without much success, that he could simply put the day behind him and start fresh come morning. The desert, though, had never once kept a secret in its life, and this one was already traveling faster than Gideon could ride. That night he sat a long while on his own porch without lighting a lamp, turning the day over the way a man turns a stone in his pocket. He thought about the boy's trembling hands around his hat brim, and about the old man's eyes opening, and about every voice from his own boyhood that had warned him this kindness would come back on him. He found sitting there in the dark that he did not regret it, not one drop of it, and that surprised him more than anything else about that whole strange day. Whatever it cost him, he told the empty yard, it had been worth spending. He thought, too, about his father, a quieter man than his mother had been, who had never said much about kindness one way or the other, but had once ridden 2 full days to help a stranger's wagon out of a flooded arroyo without ever learning the man's name. Gideon had asked him afterward why he'd bothered, and his father had only shrugged and said a man's word about who deserved help wasn't worth the breath it took to say it. That need was need, plain as that. Gideon hadn't understood it then, young as he was. Sitting alone on that porch with an empty canteen and a valley already starting to turn against him, he understood it a great deal better now, and he found some comfort in believing his father would have done exactly what he'd done that afternoon, without a second thought and without asking anybody's permission first. The next morning, Gideon rode the 8 miles into town for flour, coffee, and wire, enough to mend the fence that had started this whole business. He tied his horse outside the general store the way he had 100 times before, and it was only when he stepped up onto the boardwalk that he noticed the quiet had a different shape to it than usual. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when he pushed through the door. The silence held a beat too long before whispers began threading from one corner of the store to another, low enough that he wasn't meant to catch every word, and loud enough that he caught most of them anyway. An older rancher named Harlan Boyd stepped away from the counter first, arms crossing over his chest. "Heard you gave water to a band of Apache out past the West Ridge." Gideon kept walking toward the counter, his voice even. "They were dying, Harlan." Another man near the flour sacks let his words fall flat into the quiet. "You ought to have left them where you found them." A few heads nodded along with it, the kind of agreement that spreads through a room like a fever nobody bothers to name. Someone near the back grumbled that kindness toward enemies only invited trouble down on decent folks, and Gideon felt every eye in that store fix on him at once, waiting to see what he'd do about it. He could have argued. He could have reminded every last one of them that two of the people he'd given water to were small children who had never raised a hand against anybody in their short lives. Instead, only quieter this time, he let two words answer for him again. They were dying, and let the silence hold until the store owner finally broke it, asking what he needed for his order. Outside on the porch, Sheriff Amos Calloway was waiting, an older man with iron-gray hair and a face shaped by 20 years of hard, honest work in this valley. He'd known Gideon since the boy was small enough to ride behind his own father's saddle, and there was no accusation in his manner, only a kind of weary caution as he settled his hat against the glare. "Heard what happened out west of your place." The sheriff let the words sit there plain, not asking for an explanation so much as leaving room for one. Gideon met his eyes. "Couldn't leave them, Amos. Wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I had." The sheriff let out a long breath and looked past Gideon toward the men still murmuring inside the store. "I understand that. Doesn't mean everybody else in this valley's going to see it the same way. Fear's got a way of making decent people believe things about each other that just plain aren't true. You watch yourself, son." Gideon thanked him, swung back up into the saddle and rode home, turning the sheriff's words over the whole way, wondering if a single canteen of water had just made him a stranger among his own neighbors after living beside them his entire life. The answer arrived faster than he expected, and it arrived in pieces, the way trouble in a small valley usually does. That evening he found the north pasture gate standing wide open, 3 of his best head of cattle already scattered up into the hills, and it took him past dark, riding by lantern light to round up what he could find. The following morning, a fresh cut ran clean through another stretch of fence wire he'd only just finished mending 2 days before. And the morning after that, he found a single sheet of paper nailed crooked to his barn door, the handwriting rough and unsigned. "Do not bring danger to this valley," it read. Nothing more. Gideon read it twice, folded it along its crease, and slid it into his shirt pocket rather than let it sit where anyone else might see it. He would not, he decided, let anger take root where kindness had already been planted, no matter how much easier that anger would have been to reach for. 2 nights running he lay awake listening for hoofbeats that never came, half wondering if the note's author would try something worse. And both mornings he rose anyway, saddled his horse anyway, and rode his fence line anyway, because a man who let fear run his ranch for him had already lost something no amount of cattle could buy back. Many miles east of Gideon's ranch, in a camp tucked against a stand of cottonwoods along a wash that still held a trickle of water, the family he had helped was slowly finding its strength again. The children had taken to filling small clay pots at the camp spring and racing each other back with them, laughing in a way that hadn't been in either of them 2 days before. The old man whose name was Sela, and who was regarded among his people as a man of long memory and careful judgment, could now walk the length of the camp unassisted, leaning only lightly on a walking stick worn smooth by years of use. Tahnee had raised those 2 children largely on her own, since her husband was lost to a raiding party's bullet 2 winters back, and it had left her with a hard, quiet steadiness that the whole camp had come to lean on more than she ever let herself admit. She was not a woman who trusted easily, and she had good reason not to. But she had watched a stranger kneel in the dirt in front of her children, with a hat full of water and nothing at all to gain from giving it away, and that was not a thing a person's caution simply argued away afterward. The camp itself had moved 3 times that summer already, chasing whatever water the drought hadn't yet claimed, and every family in it understood exactly how close they had come to losing Selah and Tahnee's whole line out on that rocky slope. Children who had grown up hearing their grandparents' stories of settlers who burned crops and broke treaties without a second thought now sat listening, wide-eyed as the 2 who had nearly died described a settler who had done the opposite of everything they'd ever been taught to expect. It unsettled some of the older riders more than they let on. Distrust between the 2 peoples ran deep in both directions, built out of decades of broken promises and worse, and no single kindness from one rancher was going to undo all of that on its own. But Selah, who had buried enough friends on both sides of that old quarrel to have earned the right to say so, reminded the camp more than once that a people who judged every stranger by the worst ones among them would never learn anything true about anyone at all. That evening, as the family sat together in the cooling dusk, Tahnee laid out for her father everything the rancher had done. She described how he had given them his last water without asking anything in return, how he had led them to a hidden spring that had likely saved all their lives, how he had left them what little food he carried and asked for nothing before he rode away. She lingered, too, on the look in his eyes when he'd knelt in front of her children, a look that held none of the things she had been warned all her life to expect from a settler. Tazella listened, without interrupting once, the firelight moving across the deep lines of his face. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long while, long enough that the fire burned down another inch before he finally broke the quiet, his gaze turned toward the last light fading along the western hills. His voice, when it came, was low and unhurried. A good deed makes a path between strangers. It is a narrow path, and it is easily overgrown if no one walks it. But it is there now, whether either side chooses to see it or not. We must walk it. Word moved quietly through the camp the next morning. Several of the most respected riders began preparing their horses, checking gear, speaking together in low voices near the fire. They were not readying themselves for war, and every person in that camp who watched them knew it. They were preparing to honor a man who had chosen compassion in a moment when fear would have cost him nothing at all. 3 mornings after Gideon found that family beneath the boulder, the first gray light of dawn spread across the valley as he stepped out onto his porch to begin another day. The air held an unfamiliar coolness, a soft breeze carrying the scent of dry sage down off the ridge, and for one brief, undeserved moment, the whole desert felt almost peaceful. Then he saw the dust. A long, low cloud of it was rising along the eastern trail, too much dust for a handful of riders, too steady for a herd running loose. He shielded his eyes against the growing light and watched the shapes, at the front of it, resolve slowly into riders, more than a dozen of them, moving together in a single unhurried line across the open valley floor. At their head rode a woman he recognized instantly, and beside her an old man sitting his horse with the same quiet steadiness Gideon remembered from beneath that boulder. Word travels faster than any horse in a small valley. A young hand working a neighboring spread spotted the riders first and raced his mount into town, shouting the alarm, and within minutes the church bell was tolling hard and fast, an urgent, uneven clang that pulled people out of their homes and their beds in the same breath. Some hurried their families indoors and barred the doors behind them. Others reached for rifles that hadn't come down off the mantle in years, hands unsteady as they worked the actions. Fear moved through that valley, faster than 14 riders ever could, and most of the people spreading it were already convinced this could only mean one thing. Sheriff Calloway rode hard for the edge of town, hoping against hope he could reach the front of it before blood got spilled over a misunderstanding 2 peoples had been building toward for 2 generations. From his own porch, Gideon watched the riders come, and he understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in his chest, that he had exactly 2 choices in front of him. He could bar his own door like every other man in this valley was doing right now, and let whatever was about to happen without him standing in it, or he could walk out into that open yard and meet it. He stepped off the porch without another moment's hesitation and crossed his own dry, dusty yard until he stood alone beneath the wide morning sky, his hands loose and open at his sides, nowhere near, the revolver hanging in its holster. The Apache riders slowed as they approached and stopped together at his gate in a single unbroken line, close enough now that Gideon could make out individual faces beneath the dust. For a long moment, nobody moved, not a sound rising anywhere in that yard. The valley gone so quiet that Gideon could hear a mockingbird somewhere off in the brush, utterly indifferent to the tension standing there. Then Selah swung down from his horse, his movements slow but sure despite his age, and walked the short distance toward Gideon until barely 3 feet separated them. Behind them, half the town had gathered at the edge of the road, holding their breath along with the sheriff, rifles lowered but not yet put away. Selah reached beneath the collar of his shirt and drew out a necklace, strands of turquoise and hand-shaped beads, worn smooth by what must have been decades against his skin, clearly something carried close to the heart for a very long time. With both hands, he held it out to Gideon. Gideon stared at it for a moment, too stunned to move, before he finally reached out and accepted the gift with the same careful reverence it had been given in. Selah pressed one hand flat over his own heart, the same gesture Tahnee had made 3 days earlier at the spring, and Gideon, understanding it fully this time, mirrored it without needing to be shown twice. No words passed between them, and none were needed. The meaning had already crossed whatever distance still stood between their two peoples. One by one, the riders behind Selah dismounted and lowered their heads in a show of respect that settled over the whole yard like something almost holy. Among the townspeople watching from the road, more than a few felt something shift in their chests that they would have struggled to explain that evening over supper, a kind of quiet shame at how quickly they'd reached for old rifles over a line of riders, had crossed an entire valley for nothing more than to give thanks. Then Tahnee stepped forward and found careful, deliberate English, words she had clearly practiced on the long ride over, learned across years of trading with settlements not unlike this one. Her voice carried steady and clear across the quiet yard. "You gave life. You helped my family when no one else would. Our people remember kindness." She turned her head slightly toward the gathered townspeople watching from the road. "We do not forget it. Not ever." The silence that followed felt entirely different from the fearful silence that had gripped the valley only minutes before. One by one, rifles lowered along the road. Sheriff Calloway pulled a hat from his head and held it against his chest. Even Harlan Boyd, who had stood in that general store 2 days before and made plain that Gideon should have left the family to die in the desert, could not find a single word to argue with what he was watching unfold in front of him now. As the morning sun climbed higher over that valley, something in a great many hearts began slowly to change. For the first time and longer than most of them could remember, two peoples who had known each other only through fear and old wounds stood face to face in something close to peace. None of them yet knew that a far harder test of that new and fragile trust was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. Only a handful of days after those 14 riders had turned back east toward their camp, trouble arrived from an entirely different direction, and it arrived fast. Just before sunrise, the pounding of galloping horses shattered the quiet of the valley, and a gang of armed outlaws rode down out of the hills, driving a herd of stolen cattle ahead of them. Cattle they'd already lifted off 2 other ranches further north that same week, taking horses and supplies wherever the taking was easy. This time Gideon's gate stood directly in their path, and they came through it without slowing. The outlaws forced the gate wide and scattered his cattle into the hills in every direction. Gideon and 2 of his neighbors, a rancher named Silas Pruitt and his grown son, rushed to cut them off, but they were badly outnumbered from the first shot fired over their heads. Sheriff Calloway arrived with barely a handful of deputized men behind him, nowhere near enough to hold the line against a gang that outnumbered them nearly 3 to 1, and for a long, ugly minute it looked as though Gideon might lose everything he had spent 3 years alone rebuilding. Then, from the ridge to the east, another sound rolled across the valley, low and building, the drum of many more horses closing fast. A line of riders crested the hill and came down at a full gallop, and at their front rode Selah and Tahnee, her rifle already up and steady in her hands, her face set in a way that left no doubt she had come to finish what those outlaws had started. They struck the outlaw gang from the flank, before the gang even knew they were there, and the sudden, overwhelming arrival caught the whole outfit completely off guard. Settlers and Apache riders fought together in the churned dust of that yard, driving the outlaws back step by step until the gang broke and ran, abandoning the stolen cattle and most of their gear as they fled into the open desert rather than face down a force they hadn't seen coming and had no stomach left to fight. For a handful of minutes, nobody in that yard was thinking about who rode beside them or where that rider had come from. There was only the work in front of them, the dust and the noise and the shared unspoken understanding that whichever side of the old quarrel a man stood on, he did not want to be caught alone against a gang like that one. And every rider in that yard, settler and Apache alike, was grateful past words for the company. When the dust finally settled, an uneasy quiet fell over Gideon's yard, the kind that follows any fight nobody expected to survive. The yard stayed silent for a long moment. Then Harlan Boyd, of all people, walked toward Selah across the trampled ground, pulled the hat from his own head, and gave the old man a slow, deliberate nod. One by one, the other ranchers standing in that yard did the same, and Silas Pruitt's son, barely 18 and still catching his breath, was the last to lower his hat, but he lowered it all the same. The fear that had kept these two communities at arm's length for 2 generations had finally begun that morning to give way to something else entirely. The people of that valley understood now, in a way no amount of talking could have taught them, that courage and kindness were never measured by where a person came from, only by the choice they made in the moment it cost them the most to make it. Sheriff Calloway walked the length of that yard afterward, counting the cattle Selah's riders had helped drive back through the gate, and found himself, not for the first time that season, doing arithmetic he never expected to be doing. 14 riders had come to his town twice now, the first time to give thanks, the second time to fight, uninvited and unasked, for men who had nailed a warning to one of their own gate's neighbor's barn only weeks before. He did not have a tidy word for what that made them in his own ledger of the valley, only that whatever it was, it had earned something better than suspicion going forward, and he made that plain to anyone in earshot who'd still argue otherwise. Quick pause before we ride into how this ends. If these frontier stories are worth your evening, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. The weeks that followed brought changes nobody in that valley could have predicted even a season before. Water to the fight at Gideon's ranch traveled from one settlement to the next, carried by traders and drifters and anyone who'd heard it firsthand, the story of ranchers and Apache riders standing shoulder to shoulder instead of facing each other down a rifle barrel. Plenty of folks who hadn't seen it themselves refused to believe it at first, but the ones who had been standing in that yard knew exactly what they'd witnessed, and they weren't shy about repeating it to anyone who'd listen. As summer finally began surrendering to autumn, the long-delayed rains arrived at last, first as a distant gray line on the horizon, then as a downpour that soaked the whole valley for 3 straight days. Dry creek beds filled and ran again, new grass pushed up green through the cracked earth almost overnight. Cattle that had grown gaunt through the long drought began putting weight back on within weeks. The land was healing, and slowly, so were the people living on it. Trade began not long after, cautious at first and then steady, between the ranches scattered along the valley floor and the Apache camp to the east. Families exchanged food for blankets, leather goods for tools, hand-woven baskets for coffee and flour, a quiet economy of goodwill that neither side had thought possible a year before. Children who had once been taught by their own parents to fear one another now ran and laughed together in the deep shade of the cottonwoods along the creek, while those same parents sat nearby trading stories in a mix of 2 languages and a great many hand gestures, and somehow understood each other just fine. Even Harlan Boyd, who had once told Gideon to his face that he should have left a dying family in the desert, became a regular face at that trading ground by the following spring, arriving each time with a wagon of flour and coffee and a gruffness that never quite covered how glad he was to be there. He never apologized outright for what he'd said in that general store, not in so many words, but he made a point of greeting Selah by name every single time he rode out, and in a valley that measured a man's regret by his actions more than his speeches, that was understood by everyone as apology enough. Gideon rode out to the camp himself more than once that autumn, always with something to trade, and never with much of a reason he could put into plain words, and Tahnee always seemed to know somehow exactly which afternoons he'd come. She would set aside whatever she was working on and walk out to meet him at the edge of camp before he'd even finished tying off his horse, and neither of them ever remarked on how neither of them found that strange. The children had taken to watching for his horse from a good half-mile off, and the boy in particular had appointed himself the one who got to lead it to water, a job he guarded fiercely against his older sister's occasional attempts to claim it for herself. One cool afternoon well into autumn, Tahnee, Selah, and the two children rode once more to Gideon's ranch. This visit carried none of the desperation of their first meeting, and none of the tension of that morning at the gate. There was no fear left in anyone's eyes at all, only the easy, unhurried warmth of people who had long since stopped being strangers to each other. Selah stepped down from his horse and crossed the yard, and where their first meeting had ended in the formal exchange of a precious gift, this one ended in an embrace, the old man wrapping his arms around Gideon the way he might a friend of many years' standing, rather than a man he'd known barely a season. The two children, taller now and sun-browned from a summer spent healthy and fed, stepped forward together and held out a beautifully woven blanket their family had made, with their own hands dyed in deep reds and ochres that caught the low afternoon light. Gideon accepted it with both hands and a quiet, unhurried gratitude, understanding without anyone needing to explain it that what he was holding was worth a great deal more than cloth and thread. Tahnee stood a little apart during all of it, watching the old man and the rancher, who had once been strangers to each other, laugh together over something one of the children had blurted out, and there was a warmth in the look she gave Gideon across that yard that neither of them ever put into words. Some things she had learned in the desert beside that boulder never needed a shared language to be understood. A hand pressed over a heart had shown him everything once. This look carried something else now, something gentler, something that would keep bringing her back to this ranch on quiet afternoons for years to come, long after the story of the canteen had become something other people passed around their own fires. Neither of them ever gave that warmth a name out loud, not in front of the children, not in front of Selah, not even to themselves in the quiet after she'd ridden home. It did not need naming to be real. It sat in the space between two people who had once faced each other across a boulder with nothing but a hatful of water between them, and who now found, season after season, more and more reasons to ride the miles that separated their two worlds. Whatever it was becoming on its own time in its own way, built the same patient way as the trade routes and the friendships growing up all around it, one honest afternoon at a time. Winter came gently that year, the first easy winter the valley had seen in 3 summers of drought, and by the time the snow melted off the high country the following spring, nobody in that stretch of Arizona territory thought twice anymore about an Apache rider crossing a settler's land, or a rancher's wagon rolling into a camp east of the cottonwoods to trade for hides and cornmeal. The old fear had not vanished entirely. Old fears rarely do all at once. But it had shrunk down small enough that it no longer ran the valley the way it once had, and every season it shrank a little further, traded away one honest exchange at a time, the way most real change actually happens, quietly, and without anyone ever declaring it finished. Years later, people in that valley still carried the story of the rancher who gave his last water to a family of strangers in the desert, and of the 14 riders who came back days later, not for revenge, but to say thank you in the only way that mattered. Some thought of it as legend by then, others simply knew it as the truth, because enough of them had lived through some part of it themselves and needed no embellishment added to it. Gideon himself never claimed it was either one. He only ever believed that every life carried the same worth, no matter where a person came from or what they prayed to at night, and that the whole valley had needed reminding of that at exactly the moment it happened. In the end, it wasn't wealth or strength that changed that stretch of desert, or the people scattered across it. It was one small, costly choice, made by a man kneeling in front of two frightened children with a hat full of water and nothing at all to gain from giving it away. If this story found something in you tonight, I'd ask two small things before you go. First, if you haven't already, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It's a small, steady way to help keep true frontier stories like this one coming week after week, and it means more than you'd guess. Second, like this video and subscribe if you want. More unforgettable stories of courage, hope, and the kind of friendship that crosses every line a frontier ever drew, because sometimes the greatest change a whole valley will ever see begins with the smallest act of kindness one person was brave enough to offer, on a morning when it would have been so much easier to simply ride on by. Gideon Hale never set out to turn fear into trust, or strangers into something closer to family. He only ever meant to share the water in his canteen with two children who couldn't wait any longer for someone to stop. What grew out of that single choice outlived every warning either side had ever been raised to believe about the other, and it is still, in that valley, exactly the kind of story people pass down to their own children on the nights they want them to understand what real courage actually looks like. Not loud, not armed, just a man kneeling in the dust and a woman deciding, against everything she'd been warned, to trust him. And years later, an old man's embrace, a woven blanket, and a valley that had finally learned to trade instead of fear. Thank you for spending this evening in that valley with Tahnee and Gideon. If you want to see where the road takes the next family this frontier tries to break, stay close, and we'll see you in the next story.